India has a strange political bargain. A small formal taxpayer base carries a large part of the burden. A much larger voting base receives subsidies, welfare schemes, and election promises. And somewhere between these two groups, roads break, schools underperform, cities flood, public money leaks, and the same political cycle begins again. This is not a story about one party. It is not even a story about one election. It is a story about incentives. The uncomfortable question is simple. What happens when a democracy learns that it is easier to distribute benefits today than to build capacity for tomorrow? I call this India's golden goose problem. The golden goose is the formal taxpayer, the salaried worker, the small business owner, the professional, the company that cannot easily hide from the tax system, the person whose income is visible, whose deductions are limited, and whose tax is collected before money even reaches the bank account. For years, India's tax base has been narrow. People often use the shorthand that around 2% of the population pays direct taxes. More recent tax return data suggests the filer base has grown, but the deeper point still remains. A relatively small formal section of India's population carries a large share of direct tax responsibility, and this creates a political paradox. The people paying the most visible taxes are not always the most powerful electoral bloc. They are scattered across cities, jobs, professions, and industries. They complain privately, but rarely organize politically. They are angry, but busy, frustrated, but fragmented, dependent on salaries, clients, contracts, and compliance. So the state knows something important. This group can be taxed again and again, but it is unlikely to revolt as a bloc. At the same time, politics has a very different relationship with the mass voter. For the mass voter, the most visible benefit is not a fiscal reform, a better logistics network, a cleaner municipal budget, or a long-term education overhaul. The most visible benefit is immediate: free rations, cash transfers, subsidized electricity, free water. Loan waivers, free transport, direct benefit schemes, welfare promises before elections. Some of these schemes are genuinely needed. India still has real poverty, real inequality, and real social vulnerability. A country like India cannot simply dismiss welfare as waste. Food security, women's cash transfers, and basic subsidies can be life-changing for poor households. But my criticism is not that all welfare is bad. The criticism is that welfare becomes politically dangerous when it turns into a substitute for state capacity. Because giving a benefit is easier than fixing a system, it is easier to announce free electricity than to reform power distribution. It is easier to promise cash transfers than to create good jobs. It is easier to waive loans than to fix farm incomes. It is easier to distribute grain than to build a high-productivity economy where fewer people need grain support in the first place. This is where the political economy becomes self-reinforcing. A government gives short-term benefits. Voters reward it. The fiscal cost is spread across taxpayers, debt, inflation, lower investment, or reduced spending elsewhere. Infrastructure gets delayed. Education quality remains weak. Public services stay unreliable. People remain dependent on the state. And in the next election, the demand for more direct benefits becomes even stronger. This becomes a cycle. Election promises lead to freebies and subsidies. Freebies create short-term relief and political loyalty. But long-term investment suffers. Infrastructure decays. Education reform gets postponed. Economic competitiveness weakens. Citizens become even more dependent on government support. And then, politicians return with more promises. The cycle does not need a conspiracy to survive. It survives because everyone inside the system is responding to incentives. Politicians want votes within 5 years. Voters want relief now. Bureaucracies want budget control. Contractors want projects. Media wants attention. Taxpayers want services, but they lack coordination. And the future has no vote bank. That is the heart of the problem. The future has no vote bank. Now look at infrastructure. India spends massive amounts on roads, highways, urban projects, water systems, sewage networks, and digital infrastructure. And yet the everyday experience of many citizens still feels broken. Roads are built and then dug up. Cities expand without drainage. Garbage collection remains inconsistent. Water shortages continue. Public works are announced with great publicity, but maintenance is ignored. We all know the familiar pattern. Contracts are awarded in ways that may favor connected players. Costs escalate. Projects are delayed. Quality is compromised. Maintenance is neglected because ribbon-cutting a new project gives more political mileage than maintaining an old one. And this is important. Bad infrastructure is not just inconvenience. It is an invisible tax. A broken road taxes your time. Bad drainage taxes your health. Poor public transport taxes your income. Unreliable electricity taxes small businesses. Weak logistics tax exports. Bad municipal services tax everyday life. So the formal taxpayer pays twice, first through actual taxes, then through private substitutes. Private school because the government school is weak. Private hospital because the public hospital is crowded. Private water tanker because the municipal supply is unreliable. Private security because policing is inconsistent. Private vehicle because public transport is poor. Private inverter because power supply is uncertain. This is why the anger is not only about tax rates. It is about the feeling that taxes do not come back as public goods. And education may be the most important part of this whole argument. Because a weak education system is not just a social failure. It is a political asset for bad governance. India has achieved high school enrollment in many places, but enrollment is not the same as learning. There is a huge gap between children going to school and children actually gaining reading, arithmetic, and critical thinking skills. Many students move through grades without mastering basics. It matters because education is the foundation of democratic accountability. A citizen who can read budgets, compare claims, understand trade-offs, question propaganda, and demand evidence is harder to manipulate. A citizen who has been trained only to memorize, obey, and survive is easier to mobilize through fear, identity, caste, religion, freebies, and outrage. Again, this does not mean politicians sit in a room and plan to keep everyone uneducated. The point is more subtle. A low-quality education system reduces pressure for better politics. And because the political cost of education failure is delayed by decades, it is easier to ignore than a subsidy demand before an election. Good schools do not produce instant votes. Free cash can. Good teachers do not create a viral headline. A dramatic announcement can. A child who learns critical thinking may transform the country 20 years later. A welfare transfer can influence a household this month. So the system keeps choosing the visible short-term win over the invisible long-term foundation. Then comes media. Media is not merely a mirror of society. It is also a machine that shapes what people fight about. A country can have bad roads, poor schools, rising costs, weak local governance, and corruption. But if the daily conversation is constantly pushed toward identity conflict, religious tension, celebrity outrage, border panic, and political drama, then governance failures become background noise. This is the genius of distraction politics. People are not told to ignore their problems. They are given bigger emotional battles to fight. Hindu versus Muslim, India versus Pakistan, one state versus another, one caste versus another, one language versus another, one party's insult versus another party's revenge. These issues may sometimes be real. Identity and security are not fake topics, but the problem begins when they become the permanent operating system of public debate. Because then, the citizen stops asking a basic question. What did you do with the money? That question is dangerous. It cuts through ideology. It cuts through slogans. It cuts through personality cults. It forces politics back to delivery. What did you do with the tax money? What did you do with the school budget? What did you do with the road contract? Why is the hospital still broken? Why is the drain still clogged? Why is the teacher absent? Why is the tender inflated? Why is the project delayed? Who benefited? A healthy democracy should make these questions normal. A manipulated democracy makes these questions feel secondary. This is where the golden goose metaphor becomes powerful. The taxpayer is treated like an ATM machine, not like a stakeholder. Money is extracted, but feedback is weak. The citizen pays, but cannot easily control priorities. Elections happen, but the choices are often shaped by identity, patronage, fear, and short-term benefits. The taxpayer is told to be patriotic, but patriotism cannot mean silently funding inefficiency forever. A serious country needs taxes. No modern state can run without them. Roads, defense, courts, policing, schools, hospitals, welfare, research, and infrastructure all require public money. The argument is not anti-tax. The argument is anti-extraction without accountability. There is a difference. Taxation with accountability builds nations. Taxation without accountability builds resentment. And that resentment is now visible in the middle class. You hear it in conversations about income tax, goods and services tax, tolls, fuel taxes, school fees, medical bills, and poor services. The anger is not just, "I pay too much." The anger is, "I pay too much and still have to arrange everything myself." That is dangerous in a democracy, because once taxpayers stop believing in the fairness of the system, compliance becomes emotional, not just legal. People start justifying evasion. They look for loopholes. They distrust every scheme. They start seeing welfare recipients as enemies instead of seeing the real issue: weak state capacity and broken political incentives. And that is another trap. The system turns citizens against each other. The taxpayer blames the poor for subsidies. The poor blame the rich for privilege. The middle class blames politicians. Politicians blame previous governments. Media blames enemies. Everyone fights everyone while the structure survives. The nuance matters here. India needs welfare. India also needs taxpayers. India needs redistribution. India also needs productivity. India needs political inclusion. India also needs fiscal discipline. India needs social justice. India also needs state capacity. The failure is not that India spends on the poor. The failure is when spending on the poor becomes an excuse to avoid building a system where fewer people remain poor. That is the difference between welfare as a bridge and welfare as a cage. A bridge moves people from vulnerability to opportunity. A cage keeps people dependent, manageable, and permanently insecure. There is another uncomfortable reality. The formal tax-paying class cannot easily organize. A salaried software engineer, a shop owner, a doctor, a small manufacturer, and a corporate executive may all pay taxes, but they do not see themselves as one political class. Their problems overlap, but their identities differ. Professional life rewards individual success, not collective bargaining. People fear retaliation, job loss, audits, reputational damage, or simply wasting time. So anger becomes a private dinner table conversation, not organized democratic pressure. And psychologically, many are trapped. They work harder to maintain lifestyle. They take loans, they pay school fees, housing costs, medical bills, and save for retirement. They do not have the time or energy to build a taxpayer movement, so they adapt. They complain, then comply. That is exactly why the system continues. But the cycle is not impossible to break. The conversation must become constructive. First, India needs a broader and fairer tax base, not by harassing the already compliant, but by widening formalization, reducing loopholes, simplifying compliance, and making evasion harder. Second, welfare must become more targeted and outcome-driven. A subsidy should not be judged only by how many people receive it. It should be judged by whether it reduces long-term dependency. Third, infrastructure spending needs radical transparency. Public dashboards, open tender data, project timelines, contractor histories, cost escalation tracking, and maintenance audits should become normal. Citizens should not need investigative journalists to know where public money went. Fourth, education reform must focus on learning, not just enrollment. Teacher vacancies, school infrastructure, basic reading and math, vocational pathways, and critical thinking should be national priorities. Fifth, media ownership and political advertising need more transparency. Citizens should know who funds the narratives they consume. A democracy cannot function if the information system is polluted by hidden incentives. And finally, taxpayers need a language of citizenship, not just frustration. The goal is not to attack welfare recipients. The goal is to demand a state that delivers both dignity and efficiency, a state that protects the poor without punishing productivity, a state that taxes fairly and spends visibly, a state that treats citizens not as vote banks, not as ATMs, not as communities to be divided, but as stakeholders. That is the real test. Because the golden goose problem is not only about money, it is about trust. When people trust that taxes become roads, schools, hospitals, safety, justice, and opportunity, taxation feels like nation building. When people believe taxes become leakage, patronage, freebies, propaganda, and crony contracts, taxation feels like extraction. India's challenge is not choosing between welfare and growth. It is building a politics where welfare leads to growth and growth funds better public goods. The country does not need less democracy. It needs better accountability inside democracy. Because the most dangerous political system is not one where people demand too much. It is one where people stop asking where the money went.